Imagine a line drawn across the untamed American wilderness, a line that would bind a fractured nation, birth titans of industry, and forever redefine the very concept of distance. Now, imagine that this monumental line, the first transcontinental railroad, was laid not by the hands of celebrated engineers and financiers, but by an army of invisible men whose courage and sacrifice were systematically erased from history. This is the story of that erasure and the astonishing true chronicle of the 15,000 Chinese immigrants who built America's backbone, one perilous mile at a time. Chapter 1. The Promise of the Pacific. The year is 1863. America, bleeding from the wounds of its Civil War, was simultaneously consumed by a vision of dizzying ambition, a railway that would stretch from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. This was not merely an infrastructure project, it was a geopolitical imperative, a manifestation of manifest destiny, and a colossal bet on the future of the Union. The Pacific Railroad Act, passed by Congress in 1862, sanctioned this colossal undertaking, dividing the labor and the spoils between two principal companies, the Union Pacific Railroad, pushing west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific Railroad, CPRR, driving east from Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific, financed by the corrupt and politically powerful Credit Mobilier Ring, faced the relatively flat, albeit volatile, terrain of the Great Plains. They battled nomadic Native American tribes, harsh blizzards, and their own internal corruption, yet their progress was steady, fueled largely by an itinerant workforce of Irish veterans, former soldiers, and European immigrants. The real challenge, the impossible challenge, belonged to the Central Pacific. The Great Barrier, the Sierra Nevada. The CPRR was led by the so-called Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. These four Sacramento merchants, a grocer, a hardware retailer, a dry goods owner, and a lawyer, were men of staggering avarice and iron will. They held a monopoly on the CP's profits, subsidized by massive government land grants and $48,000 in federal bonds for every mile of track laid over the mountains. The financial incentive to conquer the Sierra Nevada was astronomical, but the geological reality was terrifying. The Sierra Nevada mountain range was a granite fortress, rising thousands of feet in sheer, unyielding walls. The Donner Pass, the intended route, sat at an elevation of 7,000 feet, where winter snows could easily bury a 20-foot freight train. The task was not just to lay rails over the peaks, but to punch through them, carving out tunnels in rock that mocked the very idea of human endeavor. Theodore Judah, the CP's brilliant but ill-fated chief engineer, had surveyed the route, but now the physical execution fell largely to the CP's pragmatic superintendent, James Harvey Storbridge. Storbridge was a tough, barrel-chested New Englander, a man who believed in the power of brawn and gunpowder. He initially hired the usual labor pool, white Americans and Irish immigrants. But as the line reached the foothills of the Sierra in 1864, the workforce began to melt away. The labor was backbreaking, the conditions brutal, and the pay meager. Drilling and blasting solid granite for a few inches of progress a day was soul-crushing. Men quit in droves, often abandoning their posts for the siren call of Nevada's silver mines, where the promise of a quick fortune seemed infinitely more appealing than the slow, certain misery of the railway cut. By early 1865, Storbridge was desperate. He faced the Big Four, who were breathing down his neck, demanding rapid progress to unlock the next tranche of federal funds. He had a grand total of about 800 men, and he needed thousands. The entire project was grinding to a halt at the foot of the mountains. Charles Crocker's radical proposal. It was Charles Crocker, the driving force among the Big Four, who proposed the unthinkable. "Send to China," Crocker declared at a tense meeting of the Big Four. "Bring me the Chinese. They built the Great Wall. They can build this railroad." Storbridge was aghast. "No, sir. The Chinese are small, they're weak, and they're lazy. They will not last a week in a rock cut, much less a Sierra blizzard. They are not fit for this kind of labor. He voiced the prevailing prejudice of the era, a deep-seated belief in the physical and moral inferiority of the Chinese who had begun arriving in California during the gold rush. But Crocker cared nothing for racial prejudice, only for profit. He argued with cool, irrefutable logic. We have no other choice, Stourbridge. The Irish won't stay. The Yankees won't do the work. They're already here, a great body of men willing to work for what we offer. We need 15,000 men. And the desert's cruel hand. As they raced across the Nevada and Utah deserts, the dangers changed from rock and snow to heat and thirst. The alkali dust rose in blinding clouds, poisoning the eyes and lungs. Water was scarce, often carried in by train and strictly rationed. Furthermore, the Chinese workers, who had been spared the ravages of contaminated water in the mountains due to their tea-drinking habit, now faced an even more dangerous challenge. The increasing hostility of the white UP laborers, the occasional skirmishes with Shoshone and Paiute tribes who saw the railroad as an invasion, and the ever-present danger of explosives. It is estimated that at least 1,200 Chinese workers died during the 5-year construction of the Central Pacific, a figure that is likely a severe undercount as the CP kept notoriously poor records for their foreign workers. They died in the tunnels, crushed in collapses, blasted by premature explosions, swept away by avalanches, and lost to the unforgiving conditions of the desert. The bodies of the deceased were almost always returned to China, the bones meticulously exhumed after a period, cleaned, and shipped across the Pacific in small caskets, a final act of devotion to their ancestral lands. Chapter 4: Promontory and the Great Silence. The Transcontinental Railroad story culminates at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, on May 10, 1869. It was the moment of the Golden Spike, the ceremonial connection of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific lines, and the instant America became a truly unified nation. The missing crowd. The scene at Promontory was one of triumph, documented by 2 great photographers, Andrew J. Russell, UP, and Alfred A. Hart, CP. Dignitaries, officials, soldiers, and railroad workers from both sides gathered. Governor Leland Stanford, representing the CP, drove the ceremonial Golden Spike, missing it on the first swing. Telegrams instantly flashed across the country. Done. America exploded in celebration. Yet, a careful examination of the iconic photographs reveals a glaring omission. In the famous image of the 2 locomotives nose to nose, the UP's Jupiter and the CP's number 60, later renamed Jupiter Impress, the crowds are overwhelmingly white, consisting of Union Pacific men, engineers, and CP officials. The Chinese laborers, who comprise 90% of the Central Pacific workforce, are conspicuously absent. They were there. Just a short distance away, thousands of them had spent the previous days preparing the final grading, leveling the last track bed, and making the historic connection possible. But for the ceremony, they were relegated to the background, excluded from the frame, and ignored in the speeches. Leland Stanford, in his address, praised the workers of the CP, but deliberately omitted any mention of the Chinese, referring vaguely to the fidelity and industry of our laborers. The history, even at the moment of its making, was being deliberately sanitized. The immediate aftermath and betrayal. The moment the railroad was completed, the vast majority of the Chinese workforce was summarily laid off. They were no longer needed. The Central Pacific, having completed its gargantuan task, had no loyalty to the men who had made it possible. thousands of young Chinese men found themselves stranded in the vast, empty American West, miles from the coast, with little money and a hostile native population to contend with. Many walked back to California, while others took whatever work they could find, often as cooks, laundrymen, or domestic servants in the mining camps and growing towns along the new railway. They became the new scapegoats for the economic woes of the American West. Now that the job was done, the narrative shifted from one of necessary, efficient labor to one of a yellow peril. Economic scapegoating. With the Panic of 1873 and the ensuing economic depression, white laborers increasingly saw the Chinese as an economic threat, men who worked harder for lower wages, depressing the entire labor market. Political dehumanization. Anti-Chinese sentiment became a major political platform. Politicians and newspapers relentlessly portrayed them as immoral, disease-ridden,